The December wind cut through Denver's Union Station like a frozen blade on that evening in 1952, sending most travelers scurrying for the warmth of nearby hotels. But Jackson Pierce stood alone on Platform 7, his expensive wool coat barely protecting him from the -20-degree cold that seemed determined to freeze everything it touched. At 38, Jackson had more money than most men could spend in 3 lifetimes. His cattle ranch spreading across 10,000 acres of Texas land that had surprised everyone by producing oil 2 years ago, making him wealthy beyond imagination. Yet none of it mattered as he waited for the delayed train to Dallas, thinking about his 7-year-old daughter Emma, who hadn't smiled once since her mother Catherine died 3 years ago from tuberculosis. The platform stretched empty, except for the swirling snow that danced like ghosts in the yellow station lights. And Jackson pulled out Catherine's pocket watch, the one she'd given him on their wedding day, with the inscription "Time means nothing when love is eternal," checking it more from habit than need since the station master had already announced the train would be 6 hours late due to the blizzard. His business in Denver had gone perfectly, securing another 1,000 acres and 3 new oil contracts. But success felt like ash in his mouth when he imagined returning to the massive ranch house where Emma would be sitting with Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, silent as always, drawing pictures of her mother that grew less detailed each month as memories faded like morning frost. Through the white curtain of falling snow, Jackson noticed movement at the far end of the platform, a splash of navy blue against the dirty white of accumulated snow. And squinting through the storm, he saw a figure hunched on the iron bench that everyone avoided because it conducted cold like electricity. Walking closer with curiosity, overcoming his desire for solitude, he discovered a young woman in a nurse's cape, the kind he recognized from Catherine's many hospital visits. But this one was so thin, it might as well have been made of paper, and the woman wearing it was shaking so violently that the medical bag clutched in her lap rattled with each shiver. Her hands, he noticed with alarm, had turned an unnatural blue-white color, and ice crystals had formed on her eyelashes. Yet, she sat with a strange dignity, her back straight despite the cold that must have been eating into her bones like hungry wolves. Margaret Sullivan, though Jackson didn't know her name yet, had been sitting there for 2 hours after spending her last $3 on a train ticket to California, leaving nothing for food or shelter, determined to reach the nursing position that promised escape from the memories of her fiancé David, who had returned from Korea 6 months ago, only to tell her he'd fallen in love with a nurse in a field hospital in Seoul. She had worked a 16-hour shift at the Denver Veterans Hospital, tending to men whose bodies were broken by war and whose minds were haunted by things they couldn't speak about, before walking 3 miles to the station because she couldn't afford the streetcar fare. And now she sat frozen in place, too proud to beg and too desperate to leave. Jackson stood 20 feet away, watching her try to pull the inadequate cape tighter, seeing how she tucked her hands under her arms, then pulled them out again to blow on them with breath that turned to ice crystals before it could warm anything. And something about her determination not to cry, not to give up, reminded him of Catherine in her final days when she'd insisted on walking to the porch every morning to watch the sunrise, even when she could barely stand. Without conscious thought, his feet moved forward, and he was unbuttoning his coat, the $400 cashmere and wool blend that his business partner had insisted he buy to look the part in negotiations. And before Margaret could register what was happening, the heavy warmth settled around her shoulders like an embrace from God himself. She looked up with eyes that Jackson would later describe to Emma as the color of Texas bluebonnets after rain. Eyes that held a mixture of shock, suspicion, gratitude, and a fierce pride that was calculating whether accepting help from a stranger was worse than freezing to death. And Jackson saw in that moment not just a freezing woman, but a fighter who had reached the end of her rope, but hadn't let go. No one should freeze alone on Christmas week, ma'am, he said in a voice roughened by years of shouting across windswept ranges. And something in his tone, neither pitying nor condescending, but simply stating a fact, like the sun rises in the east, made Margaret's defensive walls crack, just enough to nod her acceptance. She tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering so hard that words came out as broken sounds. And Jackson noticed that her lips had taken on a dangerous purple tinge, the kind he'd seen on calves born during ice storms who didn't make it through the night without immediate warming and without asking permission. He sat down beside her on the frozen bench and pulled her against his side, feeling her resist for a moment before survival instinct overcame social propriety. "My name is Jackson Pierce," he said conversationally, as if they were meeting at a church social instead of possibly saving her from hypothermia. "And I know this seems irregular, But my late wife was a nurse, and she would haunt me forever. If I let another nurse freeze to death, while I stood by with perfectly good body heat going to waste. Margaret managed to whisper through her chattering teeth. Margaret Sullivan. And then, with effort that seemed to cost her everything, I'm not dying, just cold, which made Jackson laugh for the first time in 6 months. A sound that surprised them both with its genuine warmth. Well, Miss Sullivan, he said, standing and pulling her up with him, noting how she swayed slightly, but caught herself with that same stubborn dignity. There's a cafe in the station that's closed. But I happen to have a key since I own a small share in this railway, and I'm going to make you the strongest, hottest coffee you've ever had. And you're going to drink it while telling me why a clearly intelligent woman is sitting alone in a blizzard, instead of somewhere warm. Margaret wanted to refuse every lesson her mother had taught her about strange men screaming warnings in her head. But when she looked into Jackson's face, weathered by sun and sorrow, with lines that spoke of laughter and loss in equal measure, she saw something that her nurse's instinct, honed by watching men die while holding her hand, recognized as fundamental decency wrapped in loneliness that matched her own. I can't pay you back, she said, the words costing her pride more than the cold had cost her comfort. And Jackson's response changed everything. Ma'am, I've got more money than God and less reason to live than a ghost, so if you'd let me help you tonight, you'd be doing me the favor of remembering what it feels like to matter to someone, even if it's just for a few hours. As they walked toward the station building, Jackson's arm steady around her shoulders to keep her from falling on the ice. Margaret felt something shift in her chest that had nothing to do with the warmth slowly returning to her body, while Jackson experienced a stirring of purpose he hadn't felt since Catherine's last breath, neither of them knowing that this moment, born of bitter cold and desperate circumstance, would become the first paragraph in a love story that would span 60 years, and change not just their lives but the lives of thousands of people they hadn't even met yet. Margaret tried to return the coat 3 times as they walked through the empty station, but Jackson simply ignored her protests, while guiding her past closed ticket windows and shuttered newsstand shops toward a small door marked railway personnel, only producing a brass key from his vest pocket that clicked in the lock with the authority of ownership. The cafe inside was dark and cold, but not frozen, and Jackson moved through it with surprising familiarity, lighting gas lamps that cast dancing shadows on walls decorated with photographs of trains from the previous century, while Margaret stood near the door, still clutching her medical bag as if it might disappear. Watching this well-dressed stranger who claimed to own part of a railway work with his hands, like someone who knew labor. Sit, he said gently but firmly, pointing to a chair near the largest lamp. And when she hesitated, he added, Please, Miss Sullivan, you're swaying like a tree in wind, and if you faint, I'll have to catch you. Which would be improper without formal introduction beyond our names, making her smile despite everything as she sank into the chair. Jackson disappeared into the kitchen, and soon Margaret heard the distinctive sound of a stove being lit, pots clanging, and what sounded remarkably like humming. A tune she recognized as I'll Be Seeing You, the song that had played everywhere during the war, and she wondered what memories it held for him. 20 minutes later, he emerged with a tray that seemed impossible given the closed kitchen, steaming coffee that smelled like heaven, thick sandwiches with actual meat, and a bowl of soup that he insisted she eat first, saying, My wife taught me that warm food from inside works faster than warm clothes from outside, and Margaret found herself obeying without argument. As she ate, trying not to wolf down the food despite her 3-day hunger, Jackson sat across from her, pouring his own coffee, but not eating. And in the lamplight, she could see him properly for the first time. Weathered skin that spoke of outdoor work despite his expensive clothes, hands that were manicured but scarred, and eyes that held a sadness so deep it seemed to have its own gravity. You cooked like someone who's done it for armies, Margaret said between spoonfuls of soup, and Jackson smiled. A real smile that transformed his face from handsome to beautiful in the way that genuine emotion always does, replying, 15 ranch hands for 10 years, though they complained less than armies probably would, since they didn't have other options. The warmth of the food in the cafe was working its magic, and Margaret felt her guard dropping like ice melting from wire. And before she could stop herself, she was telling this stranger about David, about the letter that had arrived on a Tuesday morning while she was preparing medications, how he'd written that Korean winters had shown him what real cold was, and that their planned future seemed like a dream from someone else's life. Jackson listened without interrupting, refilling her coffee twice, and when she stopped, embarrassed at her outpouring, he said quietly, The cruelest wounds are the ones that leave no visible scars for others to see and understand. And something in his voice made her realize he wasn't speaking in platitudes but from experience. "Tell me about your wife," Margaret said, surprising herself with the boldness. But Jackson didn't seem offended. Instead, leaning back in his chair and looking at a point somewhere beyond the cafe walls, saying, "Catherine was 23 when we met, daughter of a banker who thought I was too rough for her. And she was probably right, but she loved me anyway. Said I made her feel real in a world of pretense." He talked about their 12 years together, about Emma's birth and Catherine's joy at being a mother, about the diagnosis that came like a thief in the night, and the 2 years of fighting a disease that didn't care about money or love or a little girl who needed her mother, and Margaret found herself reaching across the table to touch his hand, a gesture that surprised them both. Emma stopped talking after the funeral. Jackson continued, his fingers unconsciously intertwining with Margaret's, as if her touch was an anchor. "Just stopped. Like words were too heavy to carry anymore. And I've tried everything, specialists, even a psychologist from Houston, but she just draws pictures and nods or shakes her head." Margaret's nurse instincts activated, and she asked questions about Emma's behavior, her eating, her sleeping, her reactions to different situations. And Jackson answered with the detailed observation of a desperate father, not noticing that their hands remained connected across the table like a bridge between two islands of grief. The storm outside had intensified, and suddenly the station master's voice crackled through speakers they hadn't noticed, announcing that all trains were cancelled until morning at the earliest, possibly longer, and Margaret's face fell as she realized she had nowhere to go and no money to go there with. "I have a suite at the Grand Hotel," Jackson said immediately, "and before you refuse, it has 2 bedrooms and a sitting room, and I give you my word as a gentleman and on my daughter's life that you'll be as safe as in a convent." But Margaret was already shaking her head, her pride rising like a wall between them. "Then I stay here," Jackson said simply, pulling another chair over and settling in as if preparing for a long watch. "Because my mother would rise from her grave and box my ears if I left a lady alone in a closed station at night. And frankly, Miss Sullivan, this is the first conversation I've had in 3 years where I forgot to be sad for more than 5 minutes." The honesty in his statement broke something in Margaret's resistance, and she found herself saying, "Tell me about the ranch." And Jackson's face lit up as he described the land his grandfather had claimed, the horses that still ran wild in the north pasture, the way morning looked when mist rose from the creek that ran through the property, painting pictures with words that made her see it all. They talked through the night, moving from the table to chairs, pulled close together for warmth. And Margaret told him about her patients at the Veterans Hospital, young men who'd left pieces of themselves in Korean snow, how she'd learned to read their silences and ease their nightmares. Skills learned from watching her mother nurse her father through his final year after the mining accident. Jackson shared his fear that Emma would grow up broken, that all his success meant nothing if he couldn't heal his daughter's heart. And Margaret suggested techniques she'd learned for traumatized soldiers. Simple things like routine, patience, and finding new ways to communicate when words failed. At some point, Margaret dozed off, exhausted from her 16-hour shift and the emotional toll of the night. And she woke to find Jackson's coat tucked around her more securely, and him sitting guard in a chair nearby, reading a small book by lamplight that she later learned was Emily Dickinson's poetry, carried always in his pocket since Catherine's death. Dawn broke gray and uncertain through the cafe windows, the storm having passed but leaving the world transformed under 2 feet of snow. And as they watched the sun fight through clouds to paint the white world gold, Jackson said quietly, "I need to ask you something strange." And when Margaret nodded, he continued, "Write to me when you reach California. Not because I expect anything, but because knowing you made it safely will help me believe that good things still happen in this world." Margaret wanted to say no, knew she should say no, that accepting his help for one night was different from maintaining contact. But looking at his face in the morning light, seeing the hope hidden carefully behind casual words, she heard herself saying, "I'll write when I arrive, just once, to let you know." Not knowing that just once would become twice weekly for 6 months, that their letters would become lifelines across 2,000 miles, that Emma would draw pictures for Miss Margaret, who Daddy says is real even though we can't see her, and that love, the kind that reshapes entire lives, often begins not with grand gestures, but with simple kindness offered in the shelter of a railway cafe while the world sleeps, frozen outside. Margaret stared at Jackson's business card for 3 weeks after arriving in San Francisco. the elegant script reading Jackson Pierce, Pierce Ranch and Oil, Austin, Texas, worn soft from her fingers, tracing the letters during night shifts, when exhausted soldiers slept, and the hospital corridors echoed with that particular silence that only comes at 3 in the morning. She had promised herself she wouldn't write. That their night in the Denver station was just two lonely people finding temporary warmth against life's cold. But on her 21st day at San Francisco General Hospital, after saving a young Korean War veteran who reminded her painfully of David, she found herself at the nurse's station with pen and paper, writing "Dear Mr. Pierce" before she could stop herself. Her letter was cautious and formal, describing the ocean she'd never seen before arriving in California. The way fog rolled in like a living thing each morning. How different the veterans here seemed from those in Denver, younger somehow, more hopeful, despite their wounds. And she signed it simply, M. Sullivan, as if the initial could maintain distance that was already collapsing. Jackson's response arrived 8 days later, in an envelope that smelled faintly of leather and hay. His handwriting surprisingly elegant, as he wrote about Emma, speaking her first words in 3 months. Just 2 words, "pretty lady," while pointing at the window, where she'd apparently been watching for someone. And though he didn't say it directly, Margaret understood the little girl was waiting for her. Without conscious decision, Margaret found herself writing back, this time including a pressed California poppy she'd found on her walk to work, explaining how the orange reminded her of what he'd described about Texas sunsets, and she added, a simple drawing of a seal she'd seen at the pier, labeling it carefully for Emma with arrows pointing to its whiskers and flippers. Signing this letter Margaret without the protective initial. Jackson's next letter contained a photograph that made Margaret's heart skip. Emma sitting on a painted pony. Not smiling, but looking directly at the camera with eyes that seemed to ask a question. And Jackson's note on the back read, she insisted, I sent this to the nurse lady so you'd know she was real too. And Margaret found herself crying in the supply closet. Not from sadness, but from a feeling she couldn't name. The letters began flowing like water, finding its path. Twice weekly exchanges that grew from single pages to packets thick with stories. Jackson describing teaching Emma to identify constellations, while Margaret sent detailed drawings of the hospital's therapy garden, where she'd started bringing veterans to sit among the roses. Emma began adding her own contributions. Crayon drawings of horses with impossible colors and stick figures labeled Daddy, me, and Miss Margaret standing together under enormous yellow suns. And Margaret treasured these more than any love letter David had ever written, keeping them in a box that had once held her engagement ring. By the 3rd month, their correspondence had developed its own rhythm and language. Jackson writing on Sundays and Wednesdays, while Margaret wrote on Tuesdays and Fridays. And they began sharing things that had never been spoken aloud. Jackson admitted he sometimes set Catherine's place at dinner from habit, then had to remove it before Emma saw. While Margaret confessed, she still flinched when she heard helicopters, because they sounded like the ones that had taken David away 2 years ago. The other nurses began teasing Margaret about her Texas cowboy, having noticed how she smiled when sorting mail and found his letters. But Margaret couldn't explain that Jackson was both less and more than they imagined. Not a romance, but something deeper, a connection between two people rebuilding themselves through words on paper. Jackson sent her books he thought she'd enjoy. First editions of Willa Cather, and poetry by Robert Frost. Always with notes in the margins where passages reminded him of something she'd written. And Margaret reciprocated with medical journals about trauma in children, marking articles that might help with Emma's selective mutism. Their intellectual courtship disguised as friendship. On a particularly difficult April night, after losing 3 patients in one shift, Margaret wrote Jackson a raw, honest letter about the futility she sometimes felt. How healing bodies seemed pointless when souls remained broken, and Jackson's response 2 weeks later included a check for $5,000, with a note saying, start something that heals. Both this isn't charity, it's investment in someone who sees what others miss. Margaret sent the check back immediately, pride flaring. But Jackson returned it again, with Emma's drawing of a hospital, with hearts for windows, and the words, please help soldiers, written in shaky 7-year-old handwriting. And Margaret found herself defeated by a child's simple request. Their letters began discussing plans, wild at first, then increasingly practical, about a different kind of rehabilitation center, where families could stay with patients, where art and music were as important as medicine, where Emma could visit and draw with veterans who'd forgotten how to smile. And without either acknowledging it, they were planning a future together. In late May, Jackson wrote something that changed everything. Emma asked me yesterday if you were real or just someone I made up to feel better. And when I showed her your letters, she said, if she's real, why doesn't she visit? And I had no good answer except that I haven't asked properly. Would you consider spending your 2-week vacation with us this July? Margaret read the invitation 17 times, knowing that accepting meant admitting their correspondence had become more than friendship, that the carefully maintained fiction of casual letter writing would dissolve the moment they saw each other again. But it was the included note in Emma's handwriting that decided her. Dear Miss Margaret, I learned to write this just for you. Daddy smiles when your letters come. Please come, make him smile in person. Love, Emma Pierce. Margaret's acceptance letter was the shortest she'd ever written. Tell Emma, I'll be there for the 4th of July. But Jackson later told her it was the only one that made him cry. Sitting at his desk with tears streaming down his face, while Emma patted his hand and said, it's okay, Daddy. Happy tears don't count as sad. The train journey from San Francisco to Austin took 3 days. And Margaret spent every mile memorizing their letters, terrified that the people they'd become on paper wouldn't match the people they were in person, that the magic of their correspondence would evaporate under the harsh Texas sun. But when the train pulled into Austin Station on July 3rd, and she saw Jackson standing on the platform holding Emma's hand, both wearing their best clothes despite the 100-degree heat, and Emma broke free to run toward her, calling Miss Margaret. Miss Margaret, you're real. Margaret knew that some stories begin with letters, not because distance makes the heart grow fonder, but because sometimes souls need to meet in words before bodies can meet in spaces. And as Jackson's arms wrapped around both her and Emma in an embrace that felt like coming home, she understood that every letter had been a brick in a bridge they'd been building without blueprints, trusting that when they finally met in the middle, the structure would hold the weight of 3 hearts, learning to beat as one. The 2 weeks at Pierce Ranch unfolded like a dream Margaret never wanted to wake from, each day beginning with Emma bursting into her guest room at dawn, climbing into bed to tell her about the dream she'd saved up all night to share, while Jackson stood in the doorway with coffee, his eyes soft with a contentment that transformed his entire face from the grieving widower she'd met in Denver to someone learning to live again. The ranch itself was nothing like Margaret had imagined from Jackson's modest descriptions in his letters. 10,000 acres of rolling hills dotted with live oaks. 3 separate houses for the ranch hands' families. A main house that looked like something from a storybook with its wraparound porch and windows that caught sunset light like captured fire. And everywhere the sound of life. Horses neighing, cattle lowing, children from the workers' families playing, creating a symphony that made her hospital world seem sterile and distant. Emma had appointed herself Margaret's personal guide and guardian, holding her hand constantly as if afraid she might disappear, teaching her to milk the gentle Jersey cow named Buttercup, showing her the secret spot by the creek where wild rabbits came to drink at twilight, and most importantly, introducing her to every person on the ranch as Miss Margaret who saves soldiers and makes Daddy laugh, a title that made the ranch hands' wives look at her with knowing smiles. Jackson taught her to ride on Catherine's horse, a gentle mare named Sterling, who hadn't been ridden since Catherine's death, and Margaret pretended not to notice the significance when he adjusted the stirrups that hadn't been touched in 3 years, his hands trembling slightly as he said, Catherine would want Sterling to carry someone who understands the value of healing. They fell into a routine that felt both new and ancient. Mornings riding together while Emma raced ahead on her pony. Afternoons helping with ranch work where Margaret discovered she enjoyed the simple physicality of feeding chickens and gathering eggs. Evenings on the porch where Jackson would point out constellations while Emma fell asleep in Margaret's lap, her small body trusting and warm like a blessing Margaret hadn't known she needed. On the 4th night, after Emma was asleep, Jackson showed Margaret his study. A room lined with books from floor to ceiling, and in the corner a telescope he'd built himself from mail-order parts and determination, explaining how studying the stars helped him feel less alone after Catherine died, how the vastness of space made his grief seem both infinite and temporary. And Margaret found herself sharing her own coping mechanisms. The way she wrote letters to her dead father, telling him about patients she'd saved as if he could somehow know. The ranch hands and their families embraced Margaret with a warmth that surprised her. Especially Rosa, the foreman's wife, who told her bluntly, Signora, we have prayed for someone to bring light back to this house, and little Emma, she blooms like a flower with you here. And Margaret realized that Jackson and Emma's grief had affected everyone on the ranch, that healing them would heal this entire small community. On her 10th day, Jackson took her to town for the monthly dance at the community center. And Margaret watched in amazement as this man she'd known through letters transformed into a leader, greeting everyone by name, asking after sick relatives, discussing crop prices and cattle futures. And she understood that his wealth hadn't isolated him, but had made him more responsible for the people who depended on him. They danced to Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, while Emma spun in circles with the other children. And when a slow song played, Jackson held her carefully, respectfully, but she could feel his heart beating against her chest, and knew hers was answering in the same rhythm. And he whispered, "I've been dead for 3 years, Margaret, and you've brought me back to life. But I'm terrified that when you leave, I'll disappear again." The next morning, Margaret woke to find Emma crying in the kitchen, and when she asked what was wrong, the little girl sobbed. "Rosa says, you leave in 4 days. But I haven't shown you everything yet, and Daddy needs you, and I need you, and Sterling needs you, and even the chickens like you better than me." And Margaret held her, rocking her while Jackson stood frozen in the doorway, his face a map of hope and fear. That evening, Jackson asked Margaret to ride with him to the highest point on the ranch, where he'd set up a dinner under the stars, complete with china and crystal that seemed absurd and perfect in the middle of a Texas pasture. And as they ate, he began speaking carefully, as if the words had been rehearsed but still came hard. "I know you have important work in California, saving lives and building something meaningful, and I know we've only spent these 2 weeks together in person. But Emma and I have been incomplete since Catherine died, and these 2 weeks have shown us what wholeness feels like again." Margaret felt tears sliding down her face as Jackson continued. "I'm not asking you to give up your career. I'm asking if there's a way to blend our lives, if you could consider staying, if we could build that rehabilitation center here, where there's space and peace." But Margaret was already shaking her head, not in refusal but in anguish, saying, "Jackson, I fought for my education when everyone said a coal miner's daughter couldn't be a nurse. I watched my mother sacrifice every dream for her children, and I promised myself I would never give up my career for any man, no matter how much I—" And she stopped, unable to say the word love. Not yet, not when it would make leaving impossible. Jackson stood up, walked to the edge of the hill where the land stretched out under stars, and said something that stopped Margaret's heart. "Then I'll sell the ranch and we'll move to California. Because Emma needs more than horses and wide spaces. She needs someone who shows her that women can be both healers and mothers, professionals and wives. That love doesn't mean giving up who you are, but finding someone who helps you become more than you imagined possible." Margaret stood up so fast her chair fell over, crossing to him in 3 strides, grabbing his arms and saying, "You can't sell this place. It's your history, your grandfather's legacy, Emma's inheritance." But Jackson turned to face her, his eyes bright with unshed tears and determination, saying, "My grandfather built this place for family, and family is more than land. It's choosing someone and being chosen. It's Emma laughing again. It's you teaching her that strength comes in many forms. It's me remembering that love isn't something you find once and lose forever, but something that can grow again if you're brave enough to let it." They stood there on the hilltop, the entire ranch spread below them like a promise. And Jackson pulled out something from his pocket, his grandmother's ring, a simple sapphire surrounded by small diamonds, saying, "This isn't a proposal. Not yet, because you need time to think, to decide. But it's a promise that, whether here, or in California, or on the moon, if that's where your work takes you, Emma and I want to be part of your life. Not as obligations, but as partners in whatever future you're building." Margaret took the ring with shaking hands, not putting it on but holding it like a question she wasn't ready to answer. And they stood together watching the stars wheel overhead, while Emma slept peacefully in the house below, unaware that her future was being decided by 2 people who had learned that love wasn't just about finding someone, but about being willing to reimagine everything for them. And as they rode back to the house in silence, both knew that Margaret's remaining for days would either be the beginning of forever or the end of everything. And that some choices, the ones that truly change everything, require not just love, but the courage to believe that 2 separate lives can become one story, without either person losing the plot of who they were meant to be. The train carried Margaret back to California, with Jackson's grandmother's ring hidden in her medical bag and his promise echoing in her mind. But what she didn't know was that Jackson had already begun the impossible. Within 3 days of her departure, he had contacted buyers for half the ranch, keeping only the original 500 acres his grandfather had first claimed. And by the time Margaret's first letter arrived, saying she needed time to think, he had already placed deposits on 3 properties near San Francisco. 6 weeks passed in a whirlwind of letters and late-night phone calls that cost more than most people's monthly wages. with Emma adding her voice to the conversations, telling Margaret about the stars she saw at night and asking when she was coming home, never saying back, but always home. As if Margaret's place with them was already decided in the child's heart. The breakthrough came when Margaret received a telegram that simply read, "Secured 50 acres near Palo Alto with perfect views for recovering soldiers, bringing Emma to see it October 15th. Please come show us where to build the healing gardens." Jackson and Margaret found herself at the train station on that date, watching as Jackson stepped off with Emma, who ran into her arms crying, "You're still real, you're still real," while passengers smiled at what they assumed was a military family reuniting, standing in the middle of the empty Palo Alto land 2 days later, with Emma chasing butterflies, while Jackson spread architectural plans on the hood of a rented truck. Margaret finally understood what he was offering, not just marriage, but partnership in something larger. A rehabilitation center that would combine her medical knowledge with his business acumen and resources, creating something neither could build alone. "The Pierce Sullivan Rehabilitation Center," Jackson said quietly, testing the words, "where soldiers and their families can heal together, where art and music matter as much as medicine, where Emma can grow up seeing that broken things can be made whole again." And Margaret found herself saying yes before he even officially asked, pulling the ring from her pocket where she'd carried it for 6 weeks and sliding it onto her finger while Emma cheered and danced around them like a small tornado of joy. They married 4 months later on the Texas ranch with only 50 guest ranch families, veterans from Margaret's hospital and Jackson's bewildered business partners who couldn't understand why he was selling prime oil land to build hospitals. But when Margaret walked down an aisle made of wildflowers wearing Catherine's wedding dress that Rosa had carefully altered, with Emma as her flower girl throwing rose petals with abandonment, everyone understood they were witnessing not just a wedding but a resurrection of 3 souls who had found each other in the ruins of their separate griefs. The Pierce Sullivan Rehabilitation Center opened 18 months later with Margaret as head nurse and Jackson as chairman. Revolutionary for 1954 in its approach, allowing families to stay with patients, incorporating art therapy before it had a name, and employing veterans as counselors, creating a cycle of healing where the healed helped others heal. And within 5 years, they had opened 3 more centers across California. Emma thrived in their blended life, spending school years in California, where she attended progressive schools that nurtured her artistic talents, and summers in Texas, where she learned to run barrel races and work cattle, growing into a young woman who moved between both worlds with ease, telling anyone who asked that she had 2 mothers, one who taught her to reach for heaven, and another who taught her to heal on earth. Margaret never stopped working, even when pregnant with their twin boys in 1955, conducting rounds until the day she delivered, then bringing the babies to the center where recovering soldiers would rock them while discussing their own children, creating an atmosphere where life and healing intertwined so naturally that visiting doctors from traditional hospitals left shaking their heads in wonder. Jackson transformed from a Texas oil man into a healthcare visionary, using his business skills to navigate bureaucracy and his charm to convince wealthy donors that investing in broken soldiers was patriotic and profitable for the soul. And by 1960, the Pierce Sullivan Foundation had become the model for veteran rehabilitation nationwide, with President Eisenhower himself visiting to commend their work. Emma, at 17, published a book of drawings and stories called Letters to Missing Mothers, documenting her journey from silence to speech, from grief to joy, with all proceeds going to the foundation. And in her dedication, she wrote, "To Catherine, who gave me life, and to Margaret, who taught me to live it." Words that made Jackson cry at the book launch while Margaret held his hand, and their 4 other children, the twins, then Sarah, then baby Catherine clustered around them. The foundation grew beyond their wildest dreams, and by 1975, 12 Pierce Sullivan centers operated across the American West, each one incorporating Margaret's revolutionary approaches to trauma treatment and Jackson's insistence that dignity and beauty were essential to healing, with gardens designed by Emma, who had become a renowned landscape architect specializing in therapeutic spaces. Their personal letters, which they never stopped writing even when living in the same house, were discovered after Margaret's death in 2010 at age 84, 5 years after Jackson had passed, and Emma, then 65 and a grandmother herself, donated them to the Smithsonian, where they became the centerpiece of an exhibition called Love in Transit, an American Story, showing how 2 strangers at a train station had created a legacy that touched thousands of lives. The final letter, written by Jackson the day before his death, was addressed to Margaret, but meant for history. My dearest Margaret, 53 years ago I gave you my coat at a train station, thinking I was saving you from the cold. But you saved me from a different kind of freezing. The kind that happens when a heart stops believing in tomorrow. Every veteran you healed, every student you taught, every child you raised with the fierce love of someone who chose them rather than simply bore them, proved that the greatest fortune I ever found wasn't oil or cattle, but a freezing nurse, who taught this cowboy that real wealth is measured in the lives we heal and the love we leave behind. Today, their great-grandchildren still run the foundation, now expanded internationally. And at the entrance of every Pierce Sullivan Medical Center hangs the same photograph taken by a Life magazine photographer in 1962, Jackson, Margaret, and Emma at the opening of the 5th center, surrounded by recovered veterans and their families, with a simple plaque that reads, "Love is not measured in the moments we breathe, but in the moments that take our breath away and give it to others." And below it, in Emma's childhood handwriting preserved in bronze, "Sometimes families are made from broken pieces that fit together perfectly." A testament to the truth that the greatest love stories aren't just about two people finding each other, but about how their love creates ripples that spread across generations, healing wounds they'll never see and touching lives they'll never know. Proving that when two people choose to build something larger than themselves, they don't just make history, they become the foundation upon which others build their own. Stories of redemption, hope, and the miraculous possibility that a chance encounter at a train station can change not just 2 lives or 3, but thousands upon thousands, each one a testament to the power of choosing love over fear, partnership over solitude, and the brave belief that broken things, when joined together with purpose and compassion, can create something unbreakably beautiful.